This isn't looking like a Nordic forest. I don't understand. What am I missing? By the tempered hammer of Thor! What is missing? What? What am I missing? I have excellent pine trees, and I have mighty oaks, and I have I know. What I am missing is, of course, some beautiful birch trees. Hi good folks, my name is Leif and I want to welcome you to my YouTube channel called Devs and Dice, where I paint miniatures or craft awesome terrain for the tabletop. Today I'm going to show you how I made these simple and durable birch trees, and they will bring a well-needed contrast with their pale bark. Just before we continue, I see that only a small percentage of you out there are actually subscribed to my channel. Please hit the subscribe button to support the channel. And remember, it's entirely free and you can change your mind at any point you want to. Alright, so with that out of the way, let's make some birch trees. Alright, so for my birch trees, I went with some already made armatures from Woodland Scenics. Now, these I bought a couple of years ago and I wasn't exactly sure when I was going to use them, but I figured these will do nicely for those birch trees that I wanted so much. The thing with these though was that they were, of course, packaged quite flat, but in addition to that, I really felt like they lacked any real character at all. And that was something that I needed to fix. All of these trees looked exactly the same. Very strange. In my vast experience of the Nordic wilderness, I have yet to see a tree that looks exactly the same as another one. You know what? I think we need to put some extra love into giving these trees some character of their own. Starting with one tree, I simply tried to rotate the top branches of the tree. Once that was done, I started spreading all of the separate branches out, trying to think of the branches in all 3 dimensions. My thinking as I did this was to try to imagine that I was a branch, desperately trying to get some sunshine in order to grow. Another aspect that was very important was to have a miniature next to me so I could really see how it looked next to the tree. And that spurred me to cut some of the branches off. Now, doing one of these things didn't really make a difference, but bit by bit as I did each step, I noticed that it started slowly to look more and more like an organic tree full with character. In my pursuit of getting these trees to look more organic, I even used some of my pliers to actually bend the trunk of a tree, giving it that organic feel as if it was reaching for the sky, always adapting to the surroundings. I also made sure that each and every one of these trees looked a little bit different, that no one tree looked exactly the same. They were bent in all kinds of directions. They strived for different things in their different contexts, and it made them eventually look somewhat unique. And the cut-off branches, I'm going to save in my bitbox and we'll see what I'll do with them. Now, my memory of birches was a bit twofold, a bit in conflict if you may. I remember smooth trunks that were white with clear black lines, but I also remembered birch trees looking much more textured and darker. So I had to do some research. And in my research, I noticed that the birch trees I have in my area were much more bulky and textured, especially around the trunk of a tree. This was something I could bring back to the crafting table. Now, going out in nature not only gave me some important insight, but also it has a tendency to refill my batteries, the fresh air, the silence, and just to remember that even though I spent most of the year inside, the world outside keeps existing just as ever. And that is a comforting thought. Now, I knew I needed to somehow increase the texture on these trees because they were quite bland and smooth. Now for me that meant that I could have used a pre-made mixture, but I wanted to be in control over how it looked, so I went with some simple PVA glue and some fine gravel that I had sieved myself. This is a very cheap way to get nice texture. Unfortunately, this brush that I'm using, I don't think it will ever be the same again, but to me, the result was actually quite stunning. The bark looked kind of like I saw when I was out earlier doing my research, and it looked quite organic. Again, I had another way to differentiate these trees from one another. And then as a final touch, I added some cork rocks at the base or the foot of the tree, just to give hints of rocks. Now, when it came to painting these little trees, I really had to think about what was it I saw earlier that day. What parts of a tree were a dark brown shade, and what were those characteristic white parts? Eventually, I sort of came to the insight that I needed to go against my instincts, which of course is to paint the recesses dark and the highlights bright. While birch trees actually tend to look exactly the opposite. So first off, I knew that usually I start priming with black, but in this case I went with gray, which is actually more, I would almost say, an off-white color. This would make it a swift job to paint all of these trees up to a good standard. And for this I obviously used the airbrush. Now halfway through I mixed in some, I think it's called Panzer Gray, which is a primer from Vallejo. And I used this on, I would say, the outer branches and transition it in more and more the higher up in the tree we got. That was my simplified version of what I saw outside. Now when it came to starting to paint these trees by brush, I started with an off-white or beige color just to sort of stipple it on here and there on the tree, just to give that indication of the brighter parts in the bark. The darker parts I went with a sort of gray-green, olive-green color, I think. And this I actually first started to stipple on, and then I noticed that, you know what? As I was doing this and hitting the sort of high ridges, it actually looked quite nice. So in the end, I eventually started to almost do an overbrush, I guess we would call it. So it would be a dry brush, but with more paint in the bristles of the brush. Here is an example where I do it quickly, because once I done one, I understood how I was gonna go about business, and to me, this actually looked quite nice. Now obviously some final details with those very characteristic lines were left. For this I went with a stark black just to accommodate the 28mm scale a little bit more. Now I knew I wanted these trees generally to be in forested areas, so when it came to the actual basing, I used some thick mud just to sort of get a nice earth texture on there. Once that had dried, I used some of my homemade black-brown wash to cover the base and parts of the lower part of a tree. Okay, so completing that step meant that I actually had all of the tree trunks done. Now it was time to focus on the canopy of the trees. I knew I wanted these to be full, but at the same time look kinda organic and sort of fluffy. Now a while back, actually at the same time as I got the armatures, I also got this material called polyfiber. Heck, I started this build with new materials, so I figured, why not continue down that track? Hopefully this will all end well. So working with this polyfiber was a first for me, and I can only explain it as a little bit softer than steel wool. Now on the package it actually said that you were supposed to use Woodland Scenics' own tacky glue, but I didn't have that, so I went on with Eileen's tacky glue. Now what I did was that I chose a couple of branches and then I sort of just teased out a piece of that polyfiber and sort of focused it bit by bit, branches by branches, foliage by foliage, and just having faith in this process that eventually it would pay off. There were plenty of times during this where I almost felt like, what the heck am I doing? This is not looking good. I don't think it was honestly, until the final sort of top where I covered that, where I felt, you know what, it's already actually starting to look kind of like a tree. And I'm kind of happy I stuck to my guns, because already here you can see the characteristics of a fluffy tree that has foliage but still can let light shine through. Now people ask me, why do you have pizza boxes stacked in your hobby space? Well, I would think that the answer would be quite obvious. I love pizza! No. But in all seriousness, I find these boxes to be quite practical, especially when you're getting into the messier side of the hobby, such as when flocking trees. The adhesion I went with was a spray glue from Noch, which is the one I found easiest around where I live. Now for the flocking, I'm using some Woodland Scenics light green clump foliage. This I've actually ground down in my coffee grinder to make it easier to handle. Now once I have all of that flocking on, I'm gonna lock it in with some PVA and water and flow improver mixture. Then I'm gonna come in with 2 types of flock on top. One to give it a little bit more texture, and one to sort of signify the highlights of the trees. And once that's on, I give it a second coat of the same spray. Now, the trees will be plenty wet, but I just let them dry, and once they do, they look quite amazing. I can really see how these nice birch trees will make quite an impression on my tabletop in the future to come. Okay, so at this point I was almost done with my dozen birch trees, but I wanted to give them that certain northern feeling and also something that was personal to me. You see, as a young boy, my mother and stepfather often took me out into the Swedish wilderness, camping, fishing, picking berries, or going mushroom hunting. The most popular mushroom in Sweden must surely be the one called the gold of the forest, or skogens guld. It's of course the lovely chanterelle. I used some green stuff to make these chanterelles, and on occasion I also used parts of a toothpick just to sort of give them a higher stem. Now, these were quite tricky to work with, but I just used a brush-on primer as best as I could and get coverage in most places. Now in order to paint these mushrooms up, I just went with something that had the color of a chanterelle. It was kind of like the color of a lion's fur, you would almost say. A little bit brown, a little bit yellow, a little bit orange. You can really see why it's gotten the name the gold of the forest. Now getting these small mushrooms glued in was also quite tricky. The same patience one uses when searching for mushrooms could really be used here. It was all about having them stuck to the superglue for a certain amount of time until the superglue adhered. Now once I had some of the mushrooms in, I went in with some forest-colored tufts here and there. The tufts give us that well-needed hint of vegetation below the tree. And I think at this point, it's time to look at the final result. Alright folks, that was it. This build went actually quite fast. The delay in the video was more to do with the production of this video took actually longer in post. I do really recommend you making these trees because they're quite durable and they can easily be used in a gaming club or such. All in all, I am very happy with the result. But what do you think? Please feel free to tell me in the comment section down below. As always, if you like the channel and you want to support it, then please like, share this video with some friends that might find it interesting, subscribe, or you can join my Patreon. And on that note, I want to extend a thanks to all of my patrons, but a special shout out goes to my legend level patron. Thank you so much, Leander. So with this, I want to thank you so much for watching. I wish you an awesome day, stay safe out there, and I will see you in the next video.